Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Humanities Research Colloquium with Professor Ed Gitre from the Department of History, who will be talking about joining us in the conversation for his research that is putting together the efforts in digital humanities in order to advance our knowledge of our nation's past. So I want to welcome Professor Gitre. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Glad to be here virtually.
Just brief introduction. So Professor Gitre is Assistant Professor of History at Virginia Tech. Ed Gitre is also Director of the American Soldier in World War II and project and funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. This Virginia Tech-based interdisciplinary digital initiative uses crowdsourcing and machine learning to offer scholars and the public a remarkable collection of uncensored handwritten commentaries composed by American service personnel during World War II. Gitre is currently working on several book manuscripts. One of these explores World War II, soldier-to-veteran readjustment, and the war's long-term social and cultural legacy. This second work is an intellectual history of interdisciplinarity and transnational dialogue in the social and behavioral sciences, and it focuses on the culture and personality movement. Third project that he's working on focuses on David Reisman Jr., his book, The Lonely Crowd, and America's Post-War Conformity. He is doing a number of collaborative projects that it is a really integral part of the digital humanities community at Virginia Tech. And so we're so delighted to be able to have you in a conversation. I'm Sylvester Johnson. I direct our Center for Humanities, and delighted to be able to engage you. So welcome again. I'm wondering if you can begin by talking with us, Ed, about the origins of this project. So how did your work start in digital humanities broadly, but particularly on this project before?
Sure, great, thank you. So I got my PhD at Rutgers University, and I was trained as a pretty traditional intellectual and cultural historian. After I finished up at Rutgers, I went to the University of Virginia and did a postdoc there. And at that period, I was working on the history of the interdisciplinary social and behavioral sciences around this concept of social adjustment. And some intellectual historians kind of tend to swerve away from World War II and focus on other topics that are more explicitly intellectual. But I really, because I was trying to think through social adjustment, I was like, I got to understand what it was like for American soldiers to readjust after the war, which really took me into the war period. So that was an interesting entryway into World War II. I hadn't grown up as a kind of military history buff at all. So at any rate, I was doing research at the National Archives. It was 2009, so over a decade ago. I was looking at some records. I knew that there was this research branch that was created to study morale. And I knew that there was this collection of microfilm. There was only one copy of this collection, and it contained comments or responses from soldiers about their experience. And no one really, very few people looked at these collections, used these collections at all. I mean, like I said, there was only one copy. And then there are other publications that came out of the research that people usually quote. So at any rate, I'm in the National Archives. It's a Saturday, and it's one of those like kind of drive-by research where I had to get through some material, and I was like, I'm just going to call up this collection and see what's in it. It comes up in a few boxes, and I put it in the microfilm reader. And really, I mean, it was one of those rare instances that you have as a historian where I knew within a couple of minutes of reading these responses that I had something, I struck gold and had something really unique on my hands. But really, I mean, unless I'm recreating from my memory that experience, but I do think at the time I did realize that this was a collection that shouldn't be stuck in a couple of boxes in the National Archives, that the public would really be interested and would learn a lot about the soldiers' experience if they had access. But at the time, I mean, I wasn't trained in the digital humanities. That wasn't the institutional setting I was working in. but it was an idea. It was like, at some day I'd like to do something with this collection. But it really wasn't until I got to Virginia Tech in 2014 where things started to really align. And I was fortunate to come into a department with a couple other colleagues who were working in the digital humanities. And that just was really inspiring. That one thing led to another. And here we are a little over a decade later. But finally, I mean, we're really close to having all of these documents digitized, transcribed, and annotated so that they can be released to the public and to scholars later this year. The target date is sometime later in the spring.
That's great. And yet you mentioned, or I had mentioned, that the project is being supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Just tell us a little bit about that support.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So I've been really, really fortunate. I mean, someone gave me some advice really early on, and it fits within kind of, I think, the kind of lab culture and being in a science environment where you work and design with prototypes, and that is just part of the language and the methods and some of the disciplines that are outside of history. And someone said, start small, like just experiment and do essentially some prototyping of a project. And that's what I did. And it was great advice. So what I did was I tested ideas, I learned. One of the first things that I did is, because I wasn't trained in the digital humanities, I partnered with a professor at Florida State. And I had my students in my World War II course transcribe and annotate letters in a collection for this other professor. He had an archive. It's at the Institute of Florida State. And in that process, he was getting something out of this relationship because he was getting letters transcribed. My students were acquiring skills in digital literacy, learning about the war. But I was learning too how to use a Mecha and Scripto and the methods and techniques of the digital humanities. But back to the idea of starting with the prototype is that the first grant I got was a startup grant, a planning grant, essentially. And it was just really invaluable. So over the course of that year, we switched from Omeka to Zooniverse, a different platform. We did a lot of work, but it just prepared us really well so that we could submit at the end of that year a competitive implementation grant. And there are different programs at the NEH that have that kind of structure in the digital humanities. So if anybody out there is thinking about doing a DH project and getting NEH funding, start with the startup planning grant. So we're now in the second year of the implementation grant. And last spring, I was a little worried when the pandemic hit, how that would affect the project. And there have been challenges with that, but on the other hand, with so many people staying at home, it's actually, we've been able to engage more people from around the world and draw them into the project and into the digital humanities, which is just, it's been so rewarding in this time of such uncertainty and concern and fear. So I've become even a greater advocate for the digital humanities and what it means for people who can't be in a classroom, who they're not 18, 20, 19 years old. I mean, now they can't be in a classroom for sure, but so many limitations to how we conceive of education, and the digital humanities has just opened up what education can look like in a much broader purview.
Yeah, it is fascinating. So many things have become very central to how we do what we do with the pandemic, and this is certainly one example of the importance of these digital tools and platforms.
Yeah.
So talk to us about the insights that you've gained from the research into this archive. It's fairly sizable, given your description of it. So what did you find out?
Yeah, so what the collection is, I probably should have described that, is that during the war, as I mentioned, that there was this research branch and they surveyed soldiers on all facets of their experience in the Army and in the war. everything from the clothes that they wore to the training they received, rations, entertainment, you name it. At the end of the survey, they were given a prompt to basically write about whatever they wanted to, regardless if they had been asked about it in the survey. And the collection is 65,000 pages of these handwritten commentaries from soldiers. Going into this, if you've studied World War II, one of the things you know is how much material was censored in one fashion or another, either officially censored, letters being censored, or lots of pressure to self-censor. And coming out of the 1990s, or starting in the 1990s, really in earnest, where there was major efforts to conduct oral histories with veterans. Hugely, hugely important, and kind of opened up new avenues for sources. But one that's a contested source, because those are recreated memories. And what I saw in this collection was that, and what made it in part unique, was that these were uncensored. And it gave me a completely different appreciation for the war. In one hand, it undercut this easy unity that everyone kind of in the greatest generation had come together and put aside their differences, but also just the level of humanity. Like these, and this is one of the things with my students when I had them transcribe, and when they transcribed, was that they saw the humanity. And that meant not only like their humor, I mean, the students really loved the jokes and the humor or any of the cartoons, but then kind of the uglier side of humanity, where one of the things that I've really focused on and been drawn to is the commentaries about Jim Crow and a segregated military with Black soldiers, and plenty of white soldiers who were more than okay with that. And I think that's one of the insights that I've gleaned from the collection, is it's forced me to really try to grapple with, what did it mean to live with the contradiction? If you were a Black man serving in the US Army in World War II, fighting for democracy, and that you were being denied what you thought was fundamental to democracy. And my students, for them too, it's something that they have to reckon with. And they're quite surprised when it's something they might know about Double V and the push for civil rights during the war. But I think some of the hardest sources that they have to grapple with are from white soldiers who wanted segregation to remain and would fight against any efforts to integrate the Army, and for them, or the anti-Semitism that they saw expressed in these commentaries. Now, not everybody, I'm focusing on kind of the extreme, but I mean, really, you just see the breadth of humanity. And in a war that can easily overwhelm the senses by, taking a statistical approach, the numbers of dead, the dollars spent, I think it's so important as a humanist, as a historian, to keep the human front and center in my research and teaching.
Well, that's actually a very compelling explanation of the way the research that you've done interfaces with the learning that happens at Virginia Tech and in your own classes, working with the students. You just told us about how they're able to participate in some ways with the research that you're conducting. They're able to be actively engaged in reading this material and trying to understand the lives of people who lived many, many decades ago, but who were caught up in or participating in or had their lives shaped by the kinds of social forces that are still in good ways and bad ways that are still relevant to our lives today. The different power systems and the conflicts that happen around race, the experience of war, the efforts to try to reintegrate different communities or peoples in the wake of something like that. So it's really, really fascinating to hear you describe it. So how has the research that you've been conducting in digital humanities broadly been part of your teaching in other ways? And what are some of the really distinctive contributions that you think the digital humanities scholarship can make?
Yeah. So, like, again, I said, as I mentioned, I wasn't trained in the digital humanities, and there are trade-offs with that. I was very self-conscious at the beginning of how much I didn't know, because when I started this project, the digital humanities community had become so broad and diverse, and diversity of methods and peoples and objectives and institutions. So that it's kind of this humbling, and so my entryway into this was through crowdsourcing. So Professor Kurt Luther with the Center for Human Computer Interaction was one of my early collaborators, and he leads a crowdsourcing lab. And that's where I've spent a lot of my time thinking. So for me, working with students in the classroom has been so informative and important for my views of digital humanities. In some ways, I didn't think about it at the time. My classroom was kind of a crowd, as it were, a particular type of crowd in this larger landscape of crowdsourcing. What is crowdsourcing? Again, there are different ways of thinking about it, but for me, it's linked to the platform that we're using. It's called Zooniverse.org. It's the largest platform in the world. It has 1.9 million members. And it got its start in citizen science work of and the earliest project, Galaxy Zoo, I think if I'm remembering correctly is the name, was to invite the public to help identify the shapes and identify the forms of galaxies and to describe them. And so the idea is that in that kind of research, you cannot do it on your own. You need assistance. And so citizen science is geared toward bringing the public to contribute to research. It started in the science, but it's been picked up in other disciplines. So when I was looking at a platform, and this was in 2017, Zooniverse had created a program, Project Builder, that allowed other people in other disciplines to create projects. But getting back to the classroom, I thought of this as prototyping. We're going to experiment. I'm going to learn digital humanities tools. But early on, I emphasized to my students that they weren't just consuming history, that they were helping to create it. And then the second, and along with that, was to, in World War II, we're thinking about citizen soldiers all the time. I mean, I'm just kind of that rhetoric I'm reading all of the time. And I think just intuitively, when I heard, citizen scientist, I didn't think of it in a conscious way, but started thinking, okay, what if I started thinking about the citizen historian and my students as citizen historians or citizen archivists, that they can contribute to something larger? And that's obviously at Virginia Tech, that's part of the ethos of service. And so there is ways in which being in this unique institutional environment channeled and really fashioned the way that I think about crowdsourcing. So in my project, because we have all of these sources that we need to get transcribed and annotated, 65,000 pages, it would take me years if I were just doing it in the classroom with my students, as productive as they were, as engaged as they were. But by using Zooniverse, this public platform that engages 1.9 million members, it really helped to not only to imagine completing the project within a reasonable period of time, but kind of further bringing down that wall between the classroom and the public. Those ideas of service and the citizen scientist, the citizen historian, and the citizen soldier. And so I'm a big proponent of involving the public as co-producers of research. They're not just consuming what we read and what we publish, but they can be part of the process. And so what we've done with Zooniverse is when we ended the last round of transcribing, the fourth round, we had like 6,700 contributors and the top transcribers. And some of those people have transcribed like 10,000 pages on their own. They became moderators, and they're going to help us validate the data. And I have thought of them not just as volunteers, but as part of the larger team for the project. So crowdsourcing is one of the areas in the digital humanities. There are various nodes. That's the one that I'm most closely connected to, although I'm moving out more and using NLP and machine learning now that we have a body of text to work with, a large body of text.
That is fascinating, particularly as you describe the range of involvement that not only your students have with this work, but also the larger public has in generating the analysis and the insights, being able to learn not just by reading what professional scholars, as you are, produce, but also, in addition to that, by being able to participate in the discovery of knowledge. I just want to remind our viewers and our listeners, we're going to invite your questions for Professor Gitre in about 20 minutes. So if you have those, please feel free to go ahead and put those into the chat or think about what you might want to ask. But before we get to our Q&A, I would love to hear you say a bit more about the importance of collaboration. So I think it's pretty familiar to most people who are working in humanities disciplines that the usual mode of doing work is solitary, where an individual does a project, and you're most frequently in history, not always, but most frequently, a solitary scholar goes into the archives and they disappear for some time and they come out with a book.
Fingers crossed.
This is right. And, that's very important work.
Yeah.
In addition to that, though, there has emerged in digital humanities scholarship something that is more familiar in other parts of our higher ed institutions, where people will typically work in teams and do less of their work in a solitary way. So it's not at all unusual to find digital humanists who are working as part of a larger team, coordinating their skills, bringing their different areas of expertise to something. So you mentioned NLP and machine learning in your last answer. I wonder if you could just explain what those things mean for those who might not be familiar with them, and talk about them within the context of how you have collaborated and used not just crowdsourcing, but also really deliberate collaboration and coordination with other experts at the university in order to conduct your work.
Right. Thank you. Again, I go back to the fact that I wasn't trained and came here and really had to get up to speed pretty quickly. I was very self-conscious about that, but now I see that there are benefits to that as well. In that, one approach to collaboration in the digital humanities is where you're a humanist and you acquire the skills of the computer scientist. And there's some great out-of-the-box solutions that you can fairly easily learn. You can learn Python and code to do the analysis yourself. I decided that not only I didn't have the time to do that. I mean, there's real value to that, and I don't want to dismiss that approach to the digital humanities. But for me, I think in part because I was here at Virginia Tech and there were so many great professors doing work in computer and data sciences, that I was just like, I'm just going to respect what those scholars can do and what do they bring to the table. And I think because of the NIH grant and having a fairly constrained period of time for getting the project up and running and completing it, from the very beginning, it had to be a team approach. And so rather than, I was like, I'm going to focus on what I can do, and I'm going to look to other scholars. So as I mentioned, Professor Luther and I collaborated, and we were together in that first grant. And he's working at the intersection of artificial intelligence and also human intelligence. And that's the way he approaches and thinks about crowdsourcing, if I can speak for him, not being here in the conversation. And so for us with Zoom, so the first step for us in the project was Zooniverse. When I joined, it was still developing the tools for the platform for transcription work. And at that point, when I launched the project, the method that was used was to have contributors transcribe on their own a document and then have multiple people transcribe the same document. So you would have, say, at least 3 different versions, and you would reconcile them using an algorithm and picking the one transcription that had the most agreement as your card. I can't get into too many of the details, but I know the general approach. So we hired an undergraduate to do that work, and he is now a graduate student in the Department of Computer Science. But last year, so that was just the beginning. So two problems emerged almost simultaneously. One was the question of volume. So I reached out to Chris North, Professor North in computer science as well, who was working with some graduate students on using, and there are multiple professors who are working with virtual reality and augmented reality, and started to partner with them. I said, I've got lots of documents and I feel constrained by a traditional monitor. Is there anything out there that I can use to explore? And so now the documents from the collection are being used in a prototype for a virtual reality tool and platform called Immersive Space to Think. And that's also through the Center for Human-Computer Interaction. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of playing. But in addition to that, in terms of analyzing this amazing output, I reached out to Mark Embry. I think even Professor Luther Kurt had mentioned him to me. And it's been a wonderful partnership. I mentored some students in the CMDA program, Computational Modeling and Data Analytics, to see what automated techniques we could use once we cleaned the documents to mine them. And so last fall we partnered, and there was a mentoring relationship. And he worked with students on applying an algorithm that had been developed and launched, I think, just the year prior by Google, to analyze and gain insights using a natural language processing, NLP technique. And that continued, and there was more mentoring that went on in the summer, another CMDA group, as well as a team from the University of Virginia. So it's been a lot of fun. It's still ongoing, but I was thinking, I've been thinking about collaboration with respect to students. We often, as professors, we caution students about what we call double dipping, recycling material for different classes. But I feel like I'm going whole hog, and we've got this amazing collection. So it's like, if I can form more partnership and use more tools to make the most of what we have, I'm game for that. And so the way that I think about collaboration is that there's a common data collection here, a textual collection. And if I can collaborate with other disciplines in order to exploit and make the most of them, that's a good in and of itself. So I can't get into too much of the techniques, but I think that can whet the appetite. People can learn more through the project.
Yeah, no, that's actually very helpful to understand the range of possibilities that have emerged through your employing digital humanities methods of scholarship, and also the ways that you've been able to connect to other experts in order to do things collaboratively that no single individual would be able to pull off. And that's true not only in terms of the scale of the volume of materials in an archive. You're talking about 65,000 pages, but it's also about the skills that are needed in order to do this. And so that's why the teams become so important, because then you get to bring together a variety of skill sets and a variety of expert knowledges that can produce some very efficacious work. So it's really helpful to hear you tell us how you've been able to do that with your work on the survey of these soldiers from the Second World War. So what do you find to be the most exciting aspect of this type of work, and what seems to be most challenging?
Most exciting and most challenging. I mean, I think in terms of exciting, No, I had the sense in the beginning of the value of the collection, and I just have seen it affirmed over and over again. And as you mentioned, scholars, we often work quietly in the archives, in the lab, in our offices. And it's not until much later when the books come out, if it's with a trade or if it gets picked up and you're able to promote it, all the better. You can hear from the public at that point. But for me to get that affirmation from the public when you need that affirmation, has been really important for me, in the process of trying to do this research. So that's really been exciting, to bring the public in and to engage them earlier on. The challenges, I think, that so when I came in at Virginia Tech, I came in as a visiting assistant professor, and was at that stage in that position for 3 years before coming on the tenure track. I wanted to get on the tenure track earlier for obvious reasons, but the only reason I feel like I've been able to do what I've done is that I didn't have that immediate pressure of tenure. And so, when you're doing a project of this size, it is really not conducive to the traditional tenure clock. And I felt so there was a feeling of a lot of risk. And I think that was one of the challenges early on, that I wasn't doing a traditional manuscript at that point. I mean, I was working on the manuscript, but this was a heavy investment. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the challenges is when you're working collaboratively, it's not like herding cats, but there's a lot of, you're not alone. You have to depend on other people. And that's a strength, but also can be a challenge. And I think that, it worked for me because I had that breathing room, but it is really difficult in a traditional trajectory unless you're on the other side of tenure and you've established yourself. So I've been fortunate with the Department of History that they've revised and have created space for digital humanities and public humanities. And so it's been more possible here. But there's been a little bit of anxiety of how this is all going to turn out. And so fingers crossed.
Yeah, no, digital humanities has definitely been a significant part of driving new conversations and discussions about what scholarship should look like and how we can do our work. As we were saying earlier, it's actually pretty typically the case that many of our colleagues in university and other disciplines are team-based. Mm-hmm. If you're in, for example, on medical research, or if you're doing an engineering project, or in many of the science fields and disciplines, people work in a lab, and you can't run a lab with one person. You need lots of people on hand. You work in shifts, and you co-author papers with sometimes 6, 7, 8 people on a single paper. And so this is actually something that is very integral to the work of scholarship, but it's not equally represented across disciplines. It tends to be the case more for some, and more solitary work tends to be the norm for others. But as you pointed to, certainly when it comes to digital humanities, we have this intersection of these methods and this ways of approaching scholarship that have brought together the humanistic inquiry and computing. And so you've given us multiple examples of how your own work has been able to really leverage both of those areas in order to do things that would not happen if it were only one or the other. And so I'm wondering, because so much attention over the years has been given to digital humanities scholarship and its implications, if you could tell us what you think of digital humanities. What is it, first of all? So some of our viewers or listeners might not be familiar with digital humanities. It's not like there's a single definition, but I'm wondering if you could just tell us, based on your own expertise and your experience with this, how do you see digital humanities? So what does it mean? And say a bit more about why it's important.
Yeah. Well, I go back again to the experience in the classroom. As a historian, as a humanist, you want to engage students in close reading of texts, to slow down and to think through what you have in front of you reading. And in history, there's different ways of doing that. Often the textbook is common, also anthologies, where you get a book that's published a number of letters or documents representative of a particular theme or a period. So the way that I think of the digital humanities is taking basically objectives that we've been instilled in, that are core to how we think about the humanities, and asking the question, how can technology enhance or to extend those skills, engage more people? And so for me, it's additive. It's not a substitute for what we do as traditional humanists. And so with the transcribing work, I remember somebody had said that it was a lot of work because they had to slow down and they felt like they got to know the person, and just like a page. And so for me, it was like, yes, the technology wasn't a distraction. Like the practice that they were engaged in, I mean, the environment was digital, but was asking them to do something so fundamental to what we do. And I could, elaborate from that and talk about how the public would say some of the same thing. Mm-hmm. So for me, when I think about the digital humanities, I think because I came in at a later period, there's just a lot of vibrancy. There are lots of different methods that are being used. But in my instance, I think of, I haven't abandoned humanities, but with all these resources, the innovation, the techniques that are available now, we've just got to, there's just so much we can do, and the possibility is really open. And I know there are people who are out there who are super skeptical and think that we're just aping social media and like these big digital companies, and I understand that. But when I see those critiques, I think to myself, well, I feel like you don't know what the digital humanities is about more broadly, and what it's capable of, and how, yes, we often partner with these with these firms and use their technologies, but they're not just subservient to them.
Oh, that's great. That's very exciting. Well, I do want to pause to again invite those of you who are listening live to send us your questions. So Ed, I'm sure would be very delighted to be able to respond to those. And already we have one question that is asking you about crowdsourcing, not just the analysis or transcription of work, but crowdsourcing methodology. And so this viewer is asking, have you learned anything about how to conduct research from your crowdsourced partners? Mm-hmm. So they're curious to know, in addition to crowdsourcing some of the work, is there any way that you might have gained insight into new ways of how to do this work because of what you've learned from crowdsourced partners?
Yeah. How to do the work? Well, so I mean, one of the things that I've been engaged in is, because I'm working in transcriptions, that is a particular aspect of crowdsourcing. For a long time, I've been using OCR, optical character recognition, on typed text. And so for me, one of the intellectual challenges is to think about hand text recognition of handwritten text. And so I'm in conversations with some of the designers at Zooniverse, and that's been really exciting because even the platform has been around for a while and has over 1.9 million members, but particularly on the humanities side, it's still a growth area. And so I continue to collaborate with them and to think. So I mean, one of the issues is like, just a simple example is how many times do you have somebody transcribe a text, or how many users, how many iterations do you need? And so there's just a lot of back and forth where with the computer science student, he generates output. We get to analyze it, go back and forth, and continue to tweak the script that I've never seen myself, what that script looks like. So I don't think that there's like one particular thing that I've learned from my collaborators. It's one of the, there's lots of fine tuning of method. I think so the public, in addition to transcribing, they are annotating and also tagging the documents. And so for me, one of the areas we're working on right now, and I'm trying to think through crowdsourcing in a slightly different way, is how do you use tagging and employ tagging to create metadata? So what we did in the beginning is we created a number of tags we called expert tags that were derived from the surveys themselves, but users could create their own, and they created thousands of tags. And so with Professor Embry, with the CMDA students, we've started to explore ways of matching user tags with expert tags. And that's an area where, like, I understand tags, and we see tags all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. But in research and for building the website and search capabilities and whatnot, we're thinking through how we can combine that human intelligence from the volunteers with the expert intelligence, knowing from on the expert side, the scope of the surveys and the problems that the Army was interested in. And that's really an ongoing process because the tags are, they're voluminous, but I think that we can gain great insight, but we need more help from machine learning and data scientists. It's ongoing.
No, it sounds that way. It's definitely there's lots of dimensions to be tackled. So,
Yeah.
so another question. This one is about the future of the book and the future of publishing,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, given your work as a digital humanities scholar, and particularly one who is a historian.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of when you think of the future of publishing and the future of, the phrase here is the future of the book, but it's not just the book. That's the future of print and the future of media, more broadly.
Yeah. I think it's Rob Stevens, one of my colleagues, who talks about being print form agnostic. I can't remember the exact term that he uses. So even though I'm like pushing for technology and innovation and the risk taking, I'm a book reader and I'm in that discipline. And just as I think of the collaboration is just opening things up and possibilities, the same thing with digital publishing and the output. So I see there being kind of less competition over, I don't have the same stakes in one or the other because I just see them as, different forms. And kind of like with the pedagogy and the students, like I have students in the classroom, but I have, the public who are engaged in the same issues and the sources using this platform. And so it's achieving the same end. And I think that I just kind of translate that into the final form of the research. So the more, platforms or technologies or media that you can use to get the research out there, all the better.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely spot on. It makes me think about a couple of things. That one is the history of the book, which is itself now a field of study, lots of history of book scholarship. But one of the things that emerged with the eruption of the printing press hundreds of years ago was a lot of anxiety about reading as a mass phenomenon, because until that point, very few people had the means or luxury to read.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to have access to a library, which most people did not. So it was usually monasteries, those who had a lot of wealth could collect these things. and you didn't read on your lunch break typically. If you were late for read, you did something else because reading wasn't just it was not practical for most people because most people were not going to have something in print to read.
Yeah.
And so when this began to be a mass phenomenon, there was a lot of anxiety about it.
Mhm.
So people said that it could cause all kinds of nervous disorders, or that it might expose people to possession by evil spirits because they were in the corner mumbling to themselves.
Yeah.
People typically read out loud
Mhm.
before it became a mass phenomenon. Now you had these people who were reading quietly to themselves, and it seemed very odd and strange. But hundreds of years later, here we are. It didn't destroy the world. In fact, now we look back on books as not a threat to our existence, but as something that might be threatened by the future. And so it
Right,
is
right.
interesting to consider how we change our sense of what normal is based on what we're accustomed to. But when I listen to you talking about that these things are not in competition, it made me think back on that history, and it also made me
Yeah.
think about the ways that we do often get access to materials and publications that we think of as print media. So newspapers, right? You can think of a newspaper. Most of us who hear that, many of us who hear that word, I can't say most, but many will think of a physical paper.
Yeah.
But it's also the case that many of us become aware of articles because of an alert on our smartphone.
Yeah.
For example, we'll see a headline through a digital medium, and maybe we go get a copy of the physical paper, or not, or maybe we just download a digital copy of it,
Yeah.
and in our digital subscription pays for those print copies that others are using.
Yeah.
But yeah, there certainly is an interdependence here. We have another question that is asking about slowing down. So
Mhm.
you had mentioned that one of your students was reading something by a World War II soldier, and they commented on the fact that it was really enlightening for them to be able to sit with something and read very slowly, not thousands of pages, but it sounded like one document that they sat with, or maybe even part of a document, but just to slowly go through it in order to have an experience of who this person was, of what they were doing, and what the significance of their experiences were as a military soldier. And so the question is, do you have anything more to say about the process
Yeah.
of either slow reading or slow something, but of slowness as part of this method of study?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned anthologies and how important, and we use them in the classroom all of the time. So one of the, I guess, the ironies of this, of the project is that I'm using technology, but if with the project, um, so the sources that we're starting with, they're handwritten, they were microfilmed right after the war, um, and only recently digitized. And so the students are working with those images. And so like the slowing down, the interaction, the feeling of connection is because of the handwriting. And so when I'm talking about the output, that presents different challenges because you could lose that. And there are projects out there. There's a really good one that I don't want to mention because it's a great project, but everything's getting transcribed and you're only seeing the transcription. And for me, that's a problem. And there was a conference and somebody was asking about those images because something gets lost. And so in our project, they're transcribing, but when things are presented to the public, we will have both the transcription, we'll have tags and annotations, but also that original image. And so you can see, because you glean something important about the human who wrote it when you can visualize it. And so even though I'm talking about challenging and pushing at the edge, at the heart of this is, again, the human expression. And so the point for me is like, okay, so how can I use technology to extend, not to replace? And just in that decision, I want people to see those images, to see the handwriting. I want to stay faithful to the original intent and what the human did at the beginning of this. But I would say also, about I want to respond to your last comments about newspapers. So, newspapers, you're right, when with different stages of kind of technological innovation with print created anxiety. In the late 19th century, there were lots of debates about democracy in relation to the newspaper, and their advocates are like, this is going to extend democracy, enlarge the public square.
Mhm.
And so I can't help but think about the anxiety around that, but also connected to how we think about democracy and citizenship. And so there are going to be debates about misinformation and platforms. It's ongoing. But on the other side of that, I think about, so I'm a cultural historian. And so the newspaper is one form. I'm really influenced by Walter Benjamin, and thinking about kind of culture is everywhere. And so this is, again, for me, the intersection of the humanities and the digital humanities, is that these tools are allowing us to have access to culture, to extend access to culture that goes beyond the written word. So for me, it goes back and forth. I want to preserve the original intent, the expression, but also to see it in different forms as well.
No, makes so much sense. I think that's spot on. We have another question that I think might have several pieces to it, and we're also getting close to our time. And so before I go to this last question, I just want to acknowledge our team that is putting together our programming for the Center for Humanities. We're partnering with the Athenaeum, and so Joe Fort is in charge of the Athenaeum, and it's made possible so much of what happens on the technical side of this. Dominique Francesca is our business manager, and I want to give thanks to her and her work. And as well, Trevor Sumraj is the graduate assistant for the Center for Humanities, and thank him for helping us to put together this program as well. So I want to turn to what maybe might have to be our last question for a time, and this is about the relationship between your work in digital humanities and the larger Tech for Humanity initiative that is happening at Virginia Tech. So how do you see the work that you're doing as being very emblematic of this initiative, and what do you think are the implications of it?
Yeah. So I'm really curious to see how it evolves. So when I came to Virginia Tech, it took me a little while to kind of figure out some of the characteristics of its institutional culture. And the one hand being the humanities and where I'm physically located, you visibly see more of the connection to its past as a military training institute and college. And as a state, obviously pervasive, its identity as a state institution, higher ed institution. But there's also this, I think it's the connection to engineering, a experimental approach and use of labs. And there are, I would meet multiple people who are working on projects. And it's very project-based. And so one of the things that I really appreciated was that the walls were low for collaboration and interdisciplinary work. And for me, so that was an opportunity to come in and be able to form these partnerships really easily. Like I didn't have to go through particular institutes. So I think for me, what I see right now with Tech for Humanity is that those walls are low. And I'm curious to see of how that collaboration gets institutionalized moving forward, where that Virginia Tech retains that, because I think it's so important for people working the digital humanities at Virginia Tech, because do you start with technology and move back to the human, or start with the human, move toward technology? I'm doing that simultaneously. And when I think about Virginia Tech, you can see there as being a kind of antagonism that you've got technology that's being imposed on everyone, and we have to adapt. But on the other hand, here I am, a traditional humanist who's being able to come into this environment and become a digital humanist and digital historian. And Virginia Tech has made that possible. So yeah.
No, I think that is very much indicative of some of the aims of this initiative. It's really thinking about the many ways that human-centered approaches need to be part of how we do technology and its development and its research and its implementation, and why technology is actually a comprehensive issue. It's not only so-called science and engineering and math or STEM disciplines, that it actually requires a lot of talent
Mhm.
across disciplines and involves all kinds of people, including yourself. You mentioned that you kept referring to the fact that your training did not involve the use of these digital tools in graduate school. It's become part of your work as a professional scholar, where
Mhm.
you learn these things. And I think that's also true of scholarship in general. I think it's fair to say that by the time someone is well into their professional career, most of what they've learned did not come from their 5, 6, 7 years in grad school or whatever. It's what they learn
Mhm.
beyond that over their time and their career that becomes so important for their expertise. And,
Mhm.
and it's certainly the case, whether it's digital tools, whether it's analog methods of doing work, that all of that is a cumulative process. But it's certainly the work that you're doing in digital humanities that speaks to the importance of this very comprehensive way of understanding what do we mean by the digital, and who should be involved. It's, as you've made clear for us in many ways, we can't set up borders and draw lines around that and assume that the digital is going to exclude historians or it's going to exclude people in, I mean, name your discipline,
Yeah.
but rather it might be anyone depending upon the work that they're doing. And so it's been exciting to see how your research has really brought to surface the important experiences from the many soldiers who were in the Second World War, and how that has shaped the way that your students are learning and is shaping the way that our experts at the university across departments and across colleges and disciplines are able to form teams together in order to make this work possible. So thank you very much for taking time to speak with us, Professor at Gitre. It's been exciting to be able to learn more about what you're doing, and so glad that you could share your work with us and others.
Thank you. This has been fun. I really enjoyed this. I
Thank
appreciate
you
the
very much.